I am 99 years old, and I will begin without hesitation. Most chronic diseases are not accidents of fate. They are the predictable outcome of how we live. That is not a slogan. It is a population-level reality supported by decades of epidemiology. When we look at cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, many cancers, and chronic respiratory illness, we are not looking at random lightning strikes. We are looking at patterns, and patterns come from behavior repeated across millions of lives. When I say most, I mean more than half. I mean a statistical majority of chronic disease burden globally is driven by modifiable risk factors. Not entirely, not purely, but dominantly. This is a causal claim, not a motivational phrase. The science is clear. Diet quality, physical inactivity, smoking, excessive alcohol use, sleep disruption, and chronic stress account for the largest share of preventable morbidity and mortality in modern societies. Now understand me carefully. Lifestyle-driven does not mean morally deserved. It does not mean genetics are irrelevant. It does not mean environment does not constrain choice. Genes load the gun. Environment may aim it, but behavior often pulls the trigger. At 99, I have watched medicine grow powerful. We have surgeries, pharmaceuticals, advanced imaging. Yet the leading causes of death remain largely chronic, non-communicable diseases tied to how populations eat, move, rest, and cope. If you expect me to tell you that disease simply appears with age, I cannot. Aging increases vulnerability, but vulnerability is not destiny. If most chronic diseases are lifestyle diseases, then most chronic suffering is, at least in part, preventable. And that is where our conversation must begin. Let me now widen the lens beyond my own life and speak at the level the title demands, the level of populations, not personalities. When epidemiologists analyze global mortality data, the dominant contributors to chronic disease are not rare genetic mutations. They are modifiable behavioral risk factors. Cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of death worldwide. Type 2 diabetes has risen in parallel with obesity and sedentary living. Hypertension tracks closely with diet quality, sodium intake, body composition, and physical inactivity. Many cancers, particularly colorectal, lung, and certain breast cancers, show strong associations with smoking, alcohol, excess body fat, and low-fiber diets. Chronic respiratory disease is overwhelmingly driven by tobacco exposure and air quality. These are not speculative links. They are replicated across countries, cultures, and decades of cohort studies. When we say most, we are not claiming 100% causation. We are saying that the majority of disease burden can be traced to risk factors that are in principle modifiable. Large-scale studies consistently estimate that a substantial proportion of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and some cancers could be prevented if populations maintained healthy body weight, engaged in regular physical activity, avoided tobacco, moderated alcohol, and consumed diets rich in whole plant foods and low in ultra-processed products. These are not fringe ideas. They are embedded in public health consensus statements across the world. Let us take cardiovascular disease as an example. Atherosclerosis does not appear overnight. It develops over decades through endothelial dysfunction, chronic inflammation, lipid imbalance, insulin resistance, and oxidative stress, all of which are strongly influenced by diet, smoking status, activity level, sleep quality, and stress hormones. Hypertension is often called essential, but in many individuals it correlates with sodium excess, low potassium intake, central obesity, and physical inactivity. Type 2 diabetes emerges not from a sudden pancreatic collapse, but from years of insulin resistance driven by caloric surplus, adiposity, and sedentary behavior interacting with genetic predisposition. Notice the pattern. Behavior interacts with biology. That is the mechanism. Genes influence susceptibility. They do not operate in isolation. Twin studies demonstrate heritability for many chronic conditions. Yet even among genetically identical individuals, lifestyle divergence leads to different outcomes. Epigenetics, the way environmental inputs influence gene expression, further reinforces the point. Behavior does not merely accompany disease. It modifies the cellular environment in which disease pathways either accelerate or slow. Obesity, often treated as a cosmetic issue, is itself a chronic disease and a driver of others. Excess adipose tissue is metabolically active. It secretes inflammatory cytokines, alters insulin signaling, increases mechanical strain on joints, and shifts hormonal balance. The rise of obesity globally parallels increased availability of calorie-dense, ultra-processed foods and decreased daily energy expenditure. Again, population patterns reveal causation at scale. Smoking remains one of the clearest illustrations. Lung cancer rates rose sharply following widespread tobacco use and declined in countries where smoking prevalence dropped. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease follows similar patterns. When exposure decreases, incidence decreases. That is causality demonstrated through historical trend reversal. Alcohol presents a more complex picture. Moderate intake may show certain associations, but excessive consumption clearly elevates risk for liver disease, certain cancers, cardiovascular complications, and neurodegeneration. Sleep deprivation contributes to metabolic dysregulation, impaired glucose tolerance, elevated cortisol, and appetite disturbance. Chronic stress sustains sympathetic activation and inflammatory pathways that worsen cardiovascular risk. Now let me introduce nuance, because rigor demands it. Lifestyle does not operate in a vacuum. Socioeconomic status shapes food access, safe spaces for exercise, healthcare availability, and stress burden. Urban design influences physical movement. Advertising influences dietary norms. Genetics influence how individuals respond to identical exposures. Some people smoke for decades and avoid lung cancer. Others develop disease despite modest exposure. Probability governs populations, not individuals. But public health is about probability. When we say most chronic diseases are lifestyle diseases, we mean that if you shift population behavior patterns, disease incidence shifts with them. We have seen this with tobacco reduction campaigns, with trans fat bans, with hypertension awareness and salt reduction efforts. When risk factor prevalence declines, so does disease burden. Critics sometimes argue that such framing blames individuals. That is not my intent. At 99, I have learned that shame rarely produces sustainable change. Structural reform matters, education matters, policy matters, but acknowledging dominant drivers is not blame, it is clarity. If we misidentify the cause, we misdirect the solution. Pharmaceutical medicine excels at acute intervention. It stabilizes blood pressure, lowers LDL cholesterol, regulates glucose, suppresses inflammation. These are invaluable tools, but they often treat downstream manifestations of upstream behaviors. If a population consumes excess refined carbohydrates, saturated fats, sodium, and alcohol while remaining sedentary and sleep deprived, Medications must work harder to compensate. If behaviors improve, medication burden frequently decreases. Epidemiological modeling studies repeatedly demonstrate that a cluster of low-risk lifestyle behaviors, healthy body mass index, non-smoking status, regular physical activity, moderate alcohol intake or abstinence, and high-quality diet correlates with dramatically lower lifetime risk of chronic disease. Not zero risk. Lower risk. The gradient is consistent. Cancer illustrates complexity. Not all cancers are lifestyle-driven. Some arise from random replication errors, inherited mutations, or environmental toxins beyond personal control. Yet smoking alone accounts for a large percentage of lung cancer cases. Obesity is linked to increased risk of colorectal, breast, postmenopausal, endometrial, and other cancers. Alcohol increases risk for certain malignancies. Diet low in fiber and high in processed meats correlates with colorectal cancer incidence. Again, behavior modifies probability. Chronic respiratory disease is strongly tied to tobacco and air pollution. While individuals may not control industrial emissions, smoking cessation dramatically reduces personal risk. Hypertension prevalence shifts with dietary sodium patterns across nations. Type 2 diabetes incidence rises in societies adopting westernized dietary patterns and sedentary occupations. The consistency across disease categories strengthens the claim. When multiple independent conditions share overlapping behavioral risk factors, it suggests systemic causation. The same cluster of lifestyle exposures influences cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and certain cancers. That convergence is not coincidence. At the same time, we must avoid absolutism. There are individuals who live with disciplined habits and still develop disease. There are others who disregard every guideline and live long lives. Biology contains variability, but policy and prevention operate on averages, not exceptions. So when I speak as a 99-year-old who has observed nearly a century of medical progress, I do not deny genetics, environment, or randomness. I assert that the preponderance of chronic disease burden in modern societies aligns with modifiable behavioral patterns. The data do not suggest that lifestyle is the only factor. They suggest it is the dominant one. And if dominance is established, responsibility shifts not solely to individuals, but to families, communities, institutions, and governments. Because if behavior drives disease at scale, then culture drives behavior. And culture can change. That is the foundation upon which the rest of my story stands. Now I will bring this down from population charts and epidemiological curves to the span of one long human life, mine, without abandoning scientific discipline. I am 99, but my story is not offered as proof. It is illustration. The data establish the pattern. My life simply shows what alignment with that pattern looks like over decades. I was born into a time when infectious disease still frightened families more than heart attacks did. Antibiotics were revolutionary. Vaccines transformed childhood survival. But as sanitation improved and acute infections declined, something else rose quietly in their place. Heart disease, diabetes, stroke, cancer. These did not explode randomly. They rose alongside industrial food production, mechanized transport, tobacco normalization, and work patterns that moved bodies less and stressed minds more. I did not understand epidemiology in my youth, but I observed behavior. The men who smoked heavily often coughed chronically by middle age. The families who shifted from whole foods to refined convenience products gained weight within a generation. As automobiles replaced walking and manual labor declined, waistlines expanded. These were not isolated anecdotes. They were social shifts. In my 40s, I watched colleagues develop hypertension. Many assumed it was simply age, yet their days were defined by high-sodium processed meals, little movement, long hours, and chronic stress. Some began medication wisely, but few altered the behaviors driving the condition. Blood pressure numbers improved on paper, but weight climbed and glucose tolerance worsened. The disease cluster expanded. By my 60s, type 2 diabetes had become common. Again, I saw a pattern. Central obesity, sedentary routines, refined carbohydrates, sugary beverages. But lifestyle convergence was striking. Those who maintained active routines, moderated caloric intake, prioritized fiber-rich foods, and avoided tobacco displayed markedly lower incidence. Let me be precise. I have never claimed immunity. I have monitored my blood pressure, lipid levels, and fasting glucose regularly. I have adjusted when trends shifted. Prevention is not a single decision. It is ongoing calibration. At 70, my LDL began creeping upward. Instead of dismissing it as age, I examined diet composition, fiber intake, saturated fat sources, and activity intensity. Small changes reversed the trajectory. That is not heroism. It is feedback response. The body is dynamic. Endothelial cells respond to nutrient flux. Skeletal muscle responds to contraction stimulus. Pancreatic beta cells respond to chronic glycemic load. Adipose tissue responds to sustained caloric surplus. When exposures change, physiology adapts, sometimes favorably, sometimes destructively. Over decades, small daily inputs accumulate into structural change. I learned early that inactivity compounds risk silently. Muscle mass declines with age. Sarcopenia is real, but resistance and weight-bearing activity attenuate that decline. Insulin sensitivity improves with movement. Blood pressure responds to aerobic conditioning. Sleep improves metabolic regulation. These are not abstract principles. They are measurable. Stress, too, became visible in my peers. Chronic sympathetic activation, constant urgency, poor sleep, emotional suppression correlated with hypertension, arrhythmias, and metabolic dysregulation. I cannot quantify cortisol across my lifetime, but I can tell you that structured recovery, sleep discipline, reflection, social connection stabilized my health markers more reliably than denial ever did. Alcohol offered another lesson. Moderate social consumption was common, but excess clearly altered waistlines, liver enzymes, and sleep patterns. I watched several friends progress from social drinking to dependency, and with it came liver disease and cardiovascular complications. The dose-response relationship was evident even without statistical training. Smoking is perhaps the clearest case. Those who quit earlier lived longer and with fewer respiratory limitations. Those who continued often faced chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, cardiovascular events, or malignancy. When cessation campaigns gained traction, new generations showed lower incidence. That temporal association reinforced causality. Now let me address genetics honestly. I had relatives who developed heart disease despite modest habits. I also had relatives who indulged recklessly and lived into their 80s. Genetic predisposition modifies thresholds. Some individuals tolerate metabolic strain longer. Others decompensate earlier. But across the extended family tree, patterns align strongly with behavior clusters. The concept of epigenetics, which emerged later in my life, helped me understand what I had observed intuitively. Environmental inputs, diet, toxins, stress influence gene expression without altering DNA sequence. Methylation patterns shift. Inflammatory pathways activate. Metabolic genes upregulate or downregulate. In other words, genes are responsive, not sovereign dictators. At 99, I do not claim perfect compliance with every guideline across every decade. I adapted gradually. I reduced processed foods as evidence accumulated. I increased fiber intake when research linked it to lower colorectal cancer risk. I incorporated resistance training when data showed its protective effect against metabolic decline. I moderated alcohol. I never adopted tobacco. These were not acts of fear, they were acts of probability management. Chronic diseases develop over time through cumulative exposure. If exposure shifts, risk shifts, not to zero but downward. One might ask, what about those who do everything right and still develop cancer or heart disease? They exist. Random mutation, environmental toxins, and unmodifiable risk factors remain real. But at the population level, clusters of low-risk behaviors consistently correlate with extended health span. The gradient holds. Health span is the key word. Longevity without function is not victory. I remain ambulatory, cognitively intact, and largely independent, not because I avoided aging, but because I reduced the burden of modifiable disease processes. I did not eliminate inflammation, oxidative stress, or cellular senescence. I attenuated their acceleration. Pharmaceuticals have assisted me when necessary. I am not anti-medicine. I view medication as adjunctive support, not primary architecture. When blood pressure trends upward despite behavioral discipline, medication can reduce vascular strain. When lipids resist optimization, pharmacology may provide additional protection, but the foundation remains behavioral. I have also witnessed socioeconomic constraints firsthand. Not everyone has equal access to whole foods, safe exercise environments, or preventive care. Public health solutions must address structural barriers. It is unjust to demand lifestyle optimization in environments that undermine it. Yet acknowledging systemic inequity does not negate biological causation. If most chronic diseases are lifestyle diseases, then most prevention must operate upstream. Education, policy, food systems reform, urban planning, stress reduction strategies, these shape behavior at scale. Individual discipline matters. Collective infrastructure matters more. My life is not evidence that lifestyle guarantees survival. It is evidence that consistent alignment with modifiable risk reduction can extend years lived without major chronic disease. When I compare my trajectory with peers who accumulated high-risk exposures, the divergence becomes clear. The body records every pattern. Decades of excess or decades of moderation leave signatures in vascular walls, pancreatic function, adipose tissue distribution, pulmonary capacity, and neural resilience. We may not feel it immediately, but biology keeps account. At 99, I do not offer secrets. I offer patterns. And patterns, when repeated across millions of lives, become statistics. Those statistics are what justify the claim that most chronic diseases are lifestyle diseases. I have lived 99 years, and if I reduce all of this to one clear statement, it is this. Most chronic diseases are not mysteries of aging. They are the accumulated consequence of repeated exposure. Repeated exposure to excess calories, repeated exposure to inactivity, Repeated exposure to tobacco, alcohol, sleep deprivation, and chronic stress. Over decades, repetition becomes pathology. This does not mean disease is a moral failure. It does not mean genetics are irrelevant. It does not mean environment is neutral. It means probability responds to patterns. When populations adopt high-risk behavioral patterns, chronic disease prevalence rises. When those patterns shift, disease burden falls. History has shown this with smoking reduction, dietary reform, and blood pressure control campaigns. The claim that most chronic diseases are lifestyle diseases is strong because the evidence is strong. Cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, many cancers, and chronic respiratory illness share overlapping modifiable drivers. The convergence across disease categories is what gives the claim weight. I stand here at 99 not as proof of invincibility, but as proof of alignment. I aligned, imperfectly but consistently, with behaviors that lower risk. I adjusted when data shifted. I respected biology's feedback. Aging is inevitable. Vulnerability increases. But vulnerability is not destiny. The body responds to how it is treated across time. If most chronic diseases are lifestyle diseases, then most chronic decline is at least partially preventable. The future of health will not be built only in hospitals. It will be built in kitchens, streets, workplaces, and bedrooms in daily choices repeated long enough to become biology. That is not philosophy. That is epidemiology lived across a century.